Hello everybody, welcome to Ms. McGuire online video lecture, and today we cover complex traits, or they also called multifactorial traits. So let's go ahead and begin. So learning outcomes for this chapter. Distinguish between single gene and polygenic traits. Define complex traits. Explain how continuously varying traits reflect genetic and environmental influences. Explain how determining empiric risk differs from calculating a Mendelian frequency. Define heritability. Discuss how studies on adopted individuals and twins can indicate the extent to which a trait is inherited, and discuss how the method discussed in this chapter can be applied to investigate variation in body weight. So genes, environment, and traits. Few genes act alone. Environmental factors and other genes may modify expression. So that means that not only your genetics affect your phenotype, like how you look or how you behave or what your abilities are, but also the environmental factors and many other genes will determine your phenotype, not just one gene. Traits can be described as Mendelian, that caused by a single gene, or polygenic, caused by multiple genes. And I'm gonna pick up my pen over here. So the trait is your phenotype, right? So if you're tall, right, that's a trait. If your hair is blonde, it's a trait. If your eyes are brown, right, those are traits. So these traits are easily determined by a single gene. Then there's Mendelian trait. Like, for example, the earlobe, that's considered to be Mendelian trait. Or if it's caused by multiple genes, we call them polygenic trait. Both can be complex, however, also called multifactorial, right? That's what this chapter is focusing on. And complex means they are due to interaction between genes and environment. Right? Those are complex traits. So Mendelian traits can be complex and polygenic traits can be complex. That means those, for example, like your earlobe, it's a single gene, Mendelian trait, but environment might affect this trait. Or how tall you are, this is polygenic trait, because many genes determine your height, but also it can be complex because environment can influence. So here's another example, lung cancer, it's a complex trait. Variants of genes that increase the risk of becoming addicted to nicotine and of developing cancer come into play. However, they may not even be expressed if a person never smokes and breathes only fresh air. Purely polygenic traits, those not influenced by the environment at all, are very rare. So what this example tells us, that if we, for example, have a genes that give us predisposition to become a smoker, to be addicted to nicotine, right? And if we have a genes that make us susceptible to or more likely to get lung cancer, if we live in an environment that we never smoke and we never around people who smoke, then these genes might never be even expressed, right? This is how environment will affect your trait. That's why it's a complex trait. So polygenic complex traits include common ones such as height, skin color, body weight, many illnesses, and behavioral conditions and tendencies. A polygenic complex trait or condition is the consequence of contributions of several genes. Each gene confers a degree of susceptibility, but not necessarily equality. Different genes may contribute different parts of a phenotype. This is a case for migraine, for example. Polygenic traits are continuously varying. Single gene traits are discrete or qualitative, often produce an all or none effect. So if we have a trait that affected by one single gene, right, then it's usually we have it or we don't have it. Now, polygenic traits produce a continuously varying phenotype, also called quantitative. So not qualitative, but a quantitative traits. DNA sequence involved are termed quantitative trait loci or QTLs. Frequency of distribution of phenotypes form a bell-shaped curve. Even when different numbers of genes affect the trait, the curve takes the same shape. Now, so what it says that if we have some trait that determined by many genes, polygenic trait, like your height, our height as humans, right? Then if we look at a population and we will see how many people within this population are short, medium height, tall, and all in between. And if we put this, our height, in a graph, it gives us bell-shaped curve. So I think the next picture, so over here, I'll go back to the previous one. We have a student that line up based on their height. And you can see now one student here, kind of like a really short, and one student is very tall, but most of the students are medium height. And you see this bell-shaped curve, all right, of our polygenic trait. So when you're looking at polygenic trait, doesn't matter if it's a height, is that the skin color, is that the eye color, all right, traits are determined by many genes. We will see that few people will be on the extreme degrees, and so many people will be in the middle of this trait, right? So that's what it says. I will go back and says that the polygenic traits produce continuously varying phenotype. That means that we don't have like people with light skin color and dark skin color. We have all in between, continuous phenotype. Light, a little bit darker, more darker, right? So that's a continuous phenotype. Why? Because the skin color determined by many genes, right? The effect of the environment on height is obvious too, right? People who do not eat enough, for example, they do not reach their genetic potential of height. So not only height is polygenic traits, it's also complex or multifactorial because your environment play a role. If you don't eat enough or you don't eat a good food, you short in proteins, in vitamins, then even you have genetic potential to be tall, you might not reach your potential fully. So differences height between the students of the yester years, so many years ago, and today are attributed to improved diet and better overall health. Height is continuously varying polygenic trait. At least 50 genes affect variation in height, some with large effects and some with lesser effect. So now if your height is determined by at least 50 genes, right, so you can imagine how complex this pattern of inheritance is. And that's our picture here. Okay, so skin color is another example of polygenic and complex trait. That means, again, that it's determined by many genes, right? More than 100 genes affect pigmentation in skin, and it's also affected by environment. So why do we have skin color? Now, melanin that is produced by special cells called melanocytes. It protects us against DNA damage. It protects DNA damage from UV radiation, and exposure to the sun increases melanin synthesis. We know it, right? We know that why do we have this melanin? We have melanin to prevent DNA damage from sun. And when we go to beach very often, so when we increase the exposure to the sun, then our skin get darker. Our skin get darker because we increase melanin synthesis. Humans have same number of these cells, melanocytes, per unit of area. So those melanocytes, that's the ones that synthesize melanin. So we have the same number of melanocytes per unit of area of skin, but we differ in the melanosome numbers. So so those melanocytes, they make melanin and they deposit it in a special vesicle called melanosome. So how many those melanosomes they produce, that differ in the size and density of distribution of melanin. That's how we different. So we have the same number of cells, but those cells produce different number, size, and density of melanin. More than 100 genes affect pigmentation in skin, hair, and the irises. And iris is it's a muscle that gives you eye color. A simplified 3-gene model is presented next. So, well, because we have 100 genes that contribute, some reason, 100 genes that contribute in a pigmentation. We cannot make a model using 100 genes. We're going to use a 3-gene model. So we just imagine that 3 genes affect, right? So if 3 genes affect the pigmentation, if you have, and remember, for every gene, you have 2 alleles. So gene A affects how dark your skin is, gene B and gene C. But for every gene, you have 2 alleles. So if you have all recessive alleles, then your skin gonna be very light. Now over here, you have one dominant allele only. It can be dominant A or dominant B or dominant C. In all this example, your skin getting a little bit darker. Now, if you have 2 dominant allele for this amount of melanosomes, the density of melanin, then your skin is getting darker over here, 3, right? I'm sorry, 2, then 3, and you know, some people will have all dominant allele for all 3 genes. But now imagine if you have 100 genes, then of course we have way more variation, and you see this continuous bell-shaped graph. So most people will have skin of this type 3. Very few will have very light, and very few will have very dark, right? But most of the people be somewhere in the middle. So that tells us that this is polygenic traits. Many genes determine the phenotype. So definition of race based largely on skin color is a social construct more than biological concept. So when we define race based on skin color, that's nothing to do with biology, really. So if you look at these girls, they're twins, right? So they're twins, but you see one color, they're fraternal twins. However, you see one girl has very light skin, and the second girl over here has a darker skin. So how we can determine that, you know, you would look at it and say like, yeah, they're definitely a different race. So is that biological concept? Of course not. This is just what people made up. They construct social construct. It's not biological. Skin color is not a reliable indicator of ancestry even. Because if you're looking at this girl, you're thinking, okay, like what is her ancestry? And you know what? They might be even identical twins over here, I would say. I don't know. I'm not sure. They really look very, very alike. But identical twins, they still should, I think, have the same genes. However, things can happen even during development, right? So 93% of varying inherited traits are no more common in people of one skin color than any other. Okay, Now, here are some definitions that we need to know before we get to the next slide. Empiric risk measures the likelihood that a trait will recur based on incidence. Now, incidence is the rate at which a certain event occurs, and prevalence is the proportion on number of individuals who have a particular trait at a specific time, right? Okay, now let's look how we can apply this to next slides. So empirical risk is not a calculation, but a population statistic based on observation. The population might be broad, such as a ethnic group or community, or genetically more well-defined, such as families that have cystic fibrosis, for example. Now, empiric risk will increase with severity of the disease, number of affected family members, and how closely related a person is to affected persons. So, for example, cleft lip is more likely in the person who has a relative with the condition. So over here, maybe give us a more understanding what this empirical risk is. So empirical risk is recurrent. So how, what is the, percentage that this condition will happen in identical twins, for example. So in identical twins, what is our chance that both of them will have a cleft lip, right? That's our empiric risk. So go back over here. Empiric risk is over here is a likelihood that a trait will recur based on incidence. So what is our likelihood that this trait will reoccur within identical twins? And it's tell you 40%. In a sibling, it's only 4%. In a child of a parent that has a cleft lip, it's 3.5%. In a niece and a nephew of a person who has this cleft lip, it's 0.8%. First cousin, 0.3%, and in general population risk with no affected relatives will be 0.1%, right? So that's empiric risk. Again, it's a statistics based on observation, right? It's not calculation. So when we make observation of a population, and we say that based on observation of identical twins, their reoccurrence of cleft lip equals 40%. Based on observation of siblings, whatever populations they study, right? How big it is, but based on observation in sibling, we can predict that our recurrence or empiric risk of cleft lip will be 4.5%, right? Now, what is heritability? Denoted age. Heritability estimates the proportion of variation in a complex trait due to genetics in a particular population at a certain time. So, for example, we have a complex trait, right? So we have a tall person, right? So here's a tall person. Now, what is heritability of this trait? That means how much of this trait is because of the genetics. That makes sense? So the heritability equals 1, or sometimes they say like 100%. So 1 equals 100%. So heritability equals 1 for a trait whose variability is completely the result of gene action. So I'm going to put a very good video that explains this heritability on Canvas. So you can watch it that explain it in more details. I just don't have time right now to spend on one slide, but just very quickly that if we have a variety in, so for example, if we take 100 people and we measure how tall they are, we will have some variations, right? Some will be short, some will be tall. So this is variability. And if all these 100 people lived in exactly the same environment, right, then the heritability will equal 1. So if we take 100 people and they will be living in absolutely the same environment from the day they were even, okay, 100 people, impossible. Let's say we take two identical twins, right? Two identical twins. Or let's take two fraternal twins, just two fraternal twins. And these two babies, they shared environment from the moment they were in mother's uterus. So they were in the mother uterus, then they were born, then they live in the same family, they ate the same food, they did everything the same, right? But one is a little bit taller than another one, then we can say that heritability equals 1 because this variation only based on gene action if environment doesn't play any role, right? So heritability refers to the degree of variation in a trait due to genetics and not to the proportion of the trait itself attributed to genes. Variability of most traits, however, is due to differences among genes and environmental influences. So when we say that this variability, if we imagine that we have two fraternal twins, that one is tall, one is short, that live in the same environment, then heritability equals 100%. That means they only, one is taller and another is shorter only because of their genetics. However, most of the traits is the effect of many genes and environment. Okay, so here's our complex polygenic traits. That means determined by many genes and influenced by environment. It's affected by genetic variants, additive effect of all the recessive alleles, that many of them, few dominant alleles, and epistasis, how one gene affects another gene, and environmental variants. So that's all affects complex polygenic traits. Heritability estimates the genetic contribution to the variation of a trait. Observed variance in the complex polygenic traits or illness reflects genetic and environmental contributions, right? So that's, so for example, if there is some illness that is determined by several genes, right, it will be this variance in observation of this illness. So, for example, we have now here, let's say 100 people, and we see if they have this, some illness, some illness within this population, right? So that will be determined by a genetic variance within these people and environmental variance where these people live. Heritability changes as environment changes. For example, the heritability of skin color is higher in the winter months when sun exposure is less likely to increase melanin synthesis. So, so if you look at two fraternal twins, for example, right, in the winter months, then they how, and we're still like looking at, or even we don't need twins. Let's say we're looking at two sisters or two brothers, and we're looking at their skin color, right, in the winter months. So now we know that their skin color differ only because of their genes. But then we go to the summer months, and one sister might be on the beach more often, and another one stays home and study genetics, right, all day long. Then the heritability here decreases because now the difference in their skin color is mostly to environment, not to genes. So the same trait may be highly heritable in two populations, but certain variants much more common in one group due to long-term environmental differences. A population in equatorial Africa, for example, have darker skin than sun-deprived Scandinavians. Missing heritability occurs when identified genes cannot account for all the variability in a trait or illness. So this is heritabilities for some human traits. Club food heritability here is 0.8 or 80%. Height heritability is 8%. Blood pressure, I'm sorry, 80%. Blood pressure 60% or 0.6. But body mass index 0.4 to 0.7. Verbal aptitude 0.7. Mathematical aptitude 0.3. Spelling 0.5. Total fingerprinting reach count 0.9, intelligence 0.5 to 0.8, total serum cholesterol 0.6. Okay. So researchers use several statistical methods to estimate heritability. One way is to compare the proportion of people sharing a trait to the proportion predicted to share the trait. Expected proportion is derived by knowing the blood relationship of the individuals. So the proportion of genes the two people are related in a certain way share. So over here, we can see that, for example, we have siblings to siblings, right? So if you have brothers and sisters, your degree of relationship is 1%. So percent of shared gene or coefficient of relativeness is 50%, right? So you share 50% with your brothers and sisters, you share 50% with your parents, you share 25% with your uncle, aunt, niece, and nephew, half siblings 25%, grandparents 25%, first cousin 12.8%, right? So when we see this degree of relationship and the percentage shared genes, right? Then we can estimate heritability. We can estimate how much of this illness or trait is determined by genetics. All right, so we can predict it based on our knowledge, and then we can compare. So we predict, and then we make observation, and we compare it, then we can estimate this heritability. So over here, we have the diagrams that tracing relatives. So we're working for a team. So team that has some, let's say, genetic condition, and we can see that team has a sister and a brother, right? So he shares, so this is first degree of relationship. So that means they shares 50% of genes. So he shares 50% with each parent. He share that if it's second degree relatives, then 25% with his grandparents, and then with his over here, like niece and nephew. So based on this knowledge, we know what is the percentage of genes that Tim shares with his nephew and niece. Then we can predict if they can inherit this condition from Tim or not. I mean, they so I mean, they cannot inherit it from Tim. I will take it back, because Olivia and Elliot gonna inherit it from Tom and Tilly, but they related to Tim, right? So they still, so how likely it is that they will have the same disease as Tim does. So that's what they made this chart over here to determine the heritability. Okay, now adopted individuals. Similarities between adopted people and adopted parents reflect mostly environmental influences. Similarities between adoptees and their biological parents reflect mostly genetic influences. Information in both sets of parents can reveal how heredity and environment both contribute to a trait. Twin studies have largely replaced adoption methods. Concordance measures the frequency of expression of a trait in both members of monozygotic or dizygotic twins. Twins who differ in a trait are said to be discordant. The more influence genes exert over a trait, the higher the differences in concordance between MZ and DZ twins. Now, what it means, I'll explain you over here. For example, we're gonna look at the acne. Now, if we look at identical twins, and acne happens 14% in identical twins. And we're looking at fraternal twins, and fraternal twins is like just brothers and sisters. However, fraternal twins share 100% of their environment. Now, identical twins share 100% of their environment and 100% of their genes. Fraternal twins share 50% of their genes, right? Like you share 50% of genes with your brothers and sisters, and 100% of environment. So the point is in both, because what do we study? We study if this acne is determined by genes or environment, or what percent is it in our genes, and what percent of that is the environment, or Alzheimer's disease. Is it mostly your heredity, or is it the environment? So in this both situation, identical and fraternal twins, they share 100% of the environment. So environment is the same for them. So now if environment is the same, right, then we're only looking at heredity. So when we have the 14% acne happen in identical twins, and the same happen in fraternal twins, right? That tell us what? That tell us that this is so your heredity here is not that important. So your genes are not that important over here, because if it's only because of the if it's only because of the genes, you have a disease like it happened over here, right? So if autism is mostly determined by heredity, so autism is mostly determined by your genes, then identical twins will have higher concordance. So 90% chance that both identical twins will have autism, right? And only 4.5% that fraternal twins both of them will have autism. That means that this is based on your genes. So your genes affect the development of autism more than environment. Because if it's but if it's the same, right, then it's environmental factor plays role. And so I mean if me and my sister both have acne, and let's say, but you know, my sister is 5 years older than me, and we both have acne over here, then that probably not our genes, because we only share 50%. Well, and identical twins also only have 14%. That means, see, the genes doesn't play much role over here. That mostly be environment. So the point is, if we have higher occurrence of the disease of condition in identical twins compared to fraternal twins, then it's mostly heredity, like over here. So we can say autism is a heredity, or hypertension is like a lot of hypertension based of heredity. The heredity plays a higher role in development of schizophrenia than environment. But of course, it's not 100% supported by the studies either. So it can be variation. Because when we study identical and fraternal twins, we need to make sure that environment is 100% similar for two identical twins and for two fraternal twins, but it's not always possible. Right? Sometimes environment plays a role here. So we cannot, this numbers shows us concordance, right? But it's still, there's still environmental factor involved, I want to say, right? So even if you say autism is mostly it's a heredity, but still environmental factor will affect. Okay, so here's our identical twins. Now what else? So what is dizygotic twins? Those are shared environment and 50% of gene. So that's our fraternal twins. Monozygotic twins, they are identical genotype and shared environment, right? Twins raised apart, shared genotype but not environment, and adopted individuals, shared environment but not genes. So when we study this type of individuals, right, like fraternal twins, identical twins, twins that raised apart, or adopted individuals, we're looking at how much genome they share, how much of genes they share, right? Those, what is the percentage? 50% of gene between fraternal or 100% between identical. And we're looking how much of the environment they share. And based on our observation, we can predict the occurrence of the disease or condition in different group of individuals based on both genetics and environmental factors. So here's, for example, body weight. Weight is a complex trait that can be studied, determined by the rate at which food is taken in versus the rate at which the body uses it for fuel. So what is your weight? How much you eat and how much you use for energy, right? Scientific studies use a measurement called body mass index, or BMI. So BMI equals weight in kilograms divided by height squared in meters. Heritability of BMI ranges in various studies from 0.4 to 0.7, which leaves room for environmental influences on our appetites and sizes. So now our body mass, or how fit we are, or are we overweight, are we obese, is 40 to 70% is our heritability. So differences. So for example, let's say it's me and my sister. And let's say I am 150 pounds and my sister is 170 pounds, right? So why we have this different weight? Well, 40 to 70%, this is because of our genes, because we not share genes completely, right? We share 50% of genes. And the rest is our environmental influences. So here is the body mass index developed by National Center of Health Statistics in collaboration with National Center of Chronic Disease Prevention and Health Promotion, that tells you your height over here and your weight in pounds. And so when you divide, like, because you remember how we calculated, we take a weight and divide it by height squared. And if you you can pause the video, you can find your height, you can find your weight. You can use this formula, weight divided by height squared, but don't forget to use kilograms and meters, and you will see if you're healthy weight, overweight, or obese, right? Now, what affects our body weight, right? Not even body weight, but mass index, body mass index, BMI. Well, several genes, and genes determine what proteins you synthesize. So for example, leptin, it's a protein hormone produced by fat cells. So you have fat cells, they make leptin, and this leptin signals your brain, hypothalamus, to decrease your appetite, so you don't want to eat. Act in the long term to maintain weight in the long term. Ghrelin, however, is also a peptide hormone. It's produced by stomach, and it responds to hunger by increasing appetite. So leptin decrease your appetite, and ghrelin increase your appetite. Function in the short terms to regulate weight as well. But there's leptin in the long term and ghrelin in the short term. Many more genes are involved in weight regulation. So you can see over here, you have, of course, why with genes, and all of a sudden we're talking about proteins, because genes determine proteins. So here's the proteins that will decrease your appetite. There will be some proteins that increase your appetite, and those are your heredity, right? So heredity studies of obesity and BMI suggest that genes play a large role in those who tend to gain weight easily. Populations that switch to high-fat, high-calorie diet and a less active lifestyle reveal effects of the environment on body weight as well, right? So not only, so you can see heredity play a great role, but in, you know, how easily we gain weight. So if you weight, you know, if you gain weight easily, blame, don't be too hard on yourself, because a lot of it is your heritability. However, if you have populations that generation after generation after generation after generation eat high-fat food, high-calorie diet, they have less active lifestyles, that also affects their body weight. In Arizona Pima Indians, for example, they develop the highest prevalence to obesity on Earth. Another environmental influence on weight is the gut microbiome, that also, you know, not only our heredity, not only our environment, but also the microorganism inside our intestine, large intestine and small intestine affects our BMI, right? Okay, and that's it for this chapter. So let's just very quickly recall what we cover over here. So we said that many traits are determined by more than one gene. Plus, traits can be complex, and complex means environment will play a role. Now, heritability, if you go over here, back to our heritability. What is that? So heritability determines what kind of like what a percentage in a variation determined by your genes. So right there. So heritability estimates the proportion of variation in a complex trait due to genetic population. So again, so heritability means if you have, for example, two people who live in the same environment, and one of them is taller and one of them is shorter, then their heritability gonna be 100%. Because the environment is the same. That means that difference in their height, 100% due to genes, right? That's why it's a proportion of variation in the complex trait due to genetics, right? And if you have, for example, two people, one tall, one short, one live in Northern America and one live in Australia, right? In completely different environment. One in the industrial country where, you know, you drive a car, you know, your parents and you and all the stuff, and one is maybe in the urban country. So if you have like completely different environment, then heritability of the height of these people decreases. Then more environment play a larger role, right? So you cannot say that, oh, one is tall, one is short, only because of their genes, right? So, okay, so that was this chapter, complex traits or multifactorial traits. And I hope you can appreciate how complex our genetic is. right? And how fascinating it is to study human traits and why we are so different despite all many genes that and many traits that we share. Okay, I hope it was helpful and thank you for watching.